Hi everyone, my name is Taylor. I work in marketing here at Random House. Today we have a writer's routine series lined up for you, and I will be joined by Toni Jensen, who's the author of Carrie. We will have Toni here in just a second. First, I'm going to quickly pin a comment to the top so anyone who tunes in later will know what we're doing, and then we'll get Toni up here. In the meantime, feel free to ask questions about, Toni's book or her writing routine. Tell us what you're reading, where you're tuning in from. We'll get to all of that as we go. Let's see if we have Toni here. Should take just a second. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good too.
Good. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm so
Yeah.
excited to talk to you. It's been, I feel like, a long time since I've seen your face.
It's been a minute, yeah.
Yeah. So Toni, your book is Carrie, which I'll hold up here since I actually have a copy. Amazing. For those who are just tuning in, do you want to give a little bit of context as to what your book is about?
Sure. Carrie is a memoir and essays about gun violence, in particular, gun violence in relation to my life, but also violence in relation to the lives of my family members, former students, people I know. It spans the whole country, everywhere I've lived, all across the United States. And in particular, it looks at Indigenous people's lives and land and how the land was first, of course, all Indigenous land, and then what that means in relation to gun violence.
Right. There's so many incredible topics that your book covers, and I want to get into as many as we can in our time. But since this is called Writer's Routine, do you want to kind of go into what your writing routine looks like and how you kind of came to write this book?
Sure. I started this book with a few of the first essays. So I think Women in the Frack Lands and the Domestic Lives of the Inherited Lives of the Invented Lives of Domestic Birds. I never get that title right. It's a tricky one. It's a good thing that's not the title of the book. That one, those two were the first, and then some of the other chapters came next. And so those chapters really stemmed out of what was going on in 2016. There was gun violence all across the country, in my life. I think it seemed like in everyone's lives. From then through 2018 in the shooting in Orlando, my routine was really that I was having insomnia, and I would get up in the middle of the night and I would write for a couple of hours to try not to wake up my family, honestly, because it was a small house and everyone was sleeping. So the original ideas for the book came from that time period. And my routine then was much different than it is now that I don't have insomnia. Now I get up and write in the morning with my coffee like a person. But Carrie started differently from that like sleepless time when there was so much turmoil in the country.
Yeah, I remember in your author's note that you wrote for our book, is that it was almost like 3:14 in the morning every time that you would just wake up kind of haunted.
Yeah. 3:14 or 4:14. It was really strange how it was always exactly those minutes. I still don't know what to make of it. It went on for more than a year, but the foundation of the book was built then. So I guess it's a thing that had to happen.
Well, I'm glad that you're back on a regular sleep schedule.
Me too. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of your book kind of details the various encounters that you've had with gun violence, at Standing Rock when someone held a gun to your head, when you saw someone point a gun at your nephew. And I'm wondering if you can kind of tell us a little bit about some of those experiences. I think there were a couple that happened within the span of like 3 months that just felt so compacted for you.
Yeah, I mean, I had a beautiful time when I went to the water protector camps at Standing Rock. There was no violence there. I was there during a completely nonviolent period, sort of in between the time when there were rubber bullets being shot at people and then the water hoses or water cannons at the bridges, right? There was that little window where it was very peaceful there. But then, yeah, I was also researching fracking and how Indigenous people's lives are at risk because of pipeline culture. And while out around doing some work near Standing Rock, I encountered a couple of guys in a pickup truck and thought that they were hunters at first, father and son even maybe, and then realized pretty quickly that they weren't. And so, one of them objected, I guess, to my presence there. They were on high alert at the time for protesters. They were worried. It was a peaceful protest. It remains, entirely a peaceful protest, but they were worried about things happening to the pipeline. And so, Yeah, so I assumed that they thought I was part of that group, or who knows? I was a woman by myself in a very remote area. And so that ended well, I guess, right? And that, I wasn't shot or taken by force, but that doesn't mean it was an easy experience. Yeah, that was a difficult one. And then there's a chapter about my nephew and his brother having a gun pointed at them in a wealthy suburb when they were at a relative's house down by a lake, and they were fishing, and the woman thought they were intruders. They had fishing poles, they were by a lake, they were invited, they'd been there before. And so those two things, I think, in close proximity, yeah, that really, really did lay the foundation for the essays that would become the full memoir of Carrie.
And you grew up around guns too. I think your dad was a big gun carrier, and I'm kind of wondering how over time how you see guns and how your relation to them has shifted a lot.
Sure. I live in Arkansas, so the question I get the most often when people hear about this book is, well, what is your stance on guns? And early on, someone asked my then boyfriend, now my husband, that question, and he said, I think she's against gun violence. And I thought, oh, that's it. I mean, who's going to argue against that? I'm against violence. More broadly, though, as I wrote the book, I developed more and more opinions about guns and gun control. The evidence is irrefutable that the more access unfettered to guns means we have more violence. There's no statistical uncertainty on that fact. Everyone agrees on that fact. And yet in the States, we have mostly unfettered access to guns and gun violence. So yeah, I grew up with guns in the house. It was very normalized. I still think there's a way that people can have guns in their homes safely. But often that good guy with a gun has another side. It's not always someone who just hunts for pleasure or for fun. Domestic violence starts in the home. And when there's a gun in the home, there's the threat of that domestic violence turning fatal. And so these are things we have to talk about, I think, more openly in our culture, that they're possible, that they're not only possible, but that they're happening everywhere across the country. And I think we do no one any service if we don't own up to that and talk about it openly.
Right. Well, especially to your point about how you were at a peaceful protest, and which reminds me of a lot of peaceful protests that are happening in our country now around Black Lives Matter, and how I think you also wrote in another piece of writing for us about how a lot of intersections with gun violence are also intersections with racism, and how those two concepts are often very closely married. I'm wondering if you want to talk, and also you heard about how you're able to also kind of pass for white sometimes, and how that's been a very different experience for you.
Yeah, it is. It's a different experience walking around in Arkansas, where, the headquarters of the KKK are not far from where I live. It's an entirely different experience for me than it is for brown and Black, especially faculty members here, or community members, or friends and family. And so I'm fully aware of that. And I try to use my privilege whenever possible in the best sorts of ways, right? Like, people will tell me the most amazingly racist things, white people who assume that I'm on their side of an issue. And I'm not on their side of an issue, but I quietly gather the information and then turn it pretty quickly. And so it's I think important that we do that sort of talking back, and we do that sort of listening first. Then there can be no misconception. Then everything is very, very clear. So yeah, I do think that my white privilege has to be acknowledged. And so I acknowledge it throughout Carrie. And as far as violence against people of color, the police shootings and the statistics are also very clear. It's newly quantified by some really good research that police shootings are a major hazard to Black and brown people. Most of us have always known this, but also now it's quantified, right? Now we have more data. And so the fact that in America, we're only now in 2019 and 2020 starting to quantify that there's good data now about police shootings. Before, a shooting was a shooting, and no one necessarily was looking at which ones were done by police. And so I do think that's important to know. And you can't unknow it then. You can't unsee it.
Right. So another question for you, but first I'm going to quickly recap for those who are just tuning in.
Yeah.
This is Random House Live with Toni Jensen, who's the author of Carrie. And so you're sort of talking about kind of that marriage of the historical and the personal. And a lot of your book is kind of a bit of both. And I'm wondering how, as a writer, you balance that kind of when you went into that factual, historical accuracy, and then when you kind of brought in your own personal experiences.
I think it's important for all of us to know where we live. And Arkansas, even though I sound Southern because I slip into wherever I live, I sounded Welsh for the brief time I lived in Wales, which was very strange when I would meet people and they would assume I was from there, having only been there a few months. But so I know I sound like I'm from here, but I'm very much not from here culturally. And so it's important to know the trees, the flora and the fauna, the people who came before, all of it, and the people who still live here, right? So it's important for me to learn about the Osage and the Cherokee in particular and all the other Southeastern tribes because I'm not from here, I'm from up north. I think everyone needs to know that, and not just in a like moment of land acknowledgement sort of way, but in a deep lived sort of way. It comes up over and over. We had to edit some of the references out because I made so many of how I live right off MLK Junior Drive, and that's part of the Trail of Tears. But I think it's important. It bears repeating. Everyone needs to know the land they stand on and whose land it was and how it was acquired. It's very uncomfortable for a lot of people. I talk a lot in the book about university spaces because I've taught at a lot of universities, and that land is mostly stolen. And if not stolen, acquired at a very discount price. And
Right.
so, why is it that we don't talk about that more openly?
Definitely. Another part of your book that I personally really loved was the importance that you placed on words and on language. And there are a lot of definitions of various words throughout the book. Can you tell us a little bit about your decision to kind of include those dictionary definitions and what that meaning had for you?
Sure. I'm interested in how we define words and land and bodies in relation to those words. So occasionally a word would jump out or there would be an interesting term and I would think, I know that means more than one thing. And I know that probably two or three of the things that it means have relationship some way to, the subject matter that I'm writing about. So I decided pretty early on to start using Webster's dictionary. The OED seemed a little fancy for me. And Webster's then has become sort of political on Twitter and other spaces lately with how it's every, like today they had the thing about from the debate last night about stand up, stand back and the definitions. I absolutely love that they're doing that. I mean, it's a dictionary. It's someone running Twitter account for a dictionary, and yet they're taking a side. And so I'm really pleased now that I picked Webster's, but in the beginning it was just simply that I thought, yeah, they're doing a good job explaining the etymology, the history, the dates. I think that's all interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I've been seeing some questions here about other writers or books that you love, if you want to share any of those.
Yes, sure. Louise Erdrich and James Welch probably are my two favorite. So Erdrich being my favorite living writer. I love everything by her. I think she's any book of hers is a masterclass in character development and plot. I mean, if we turned this way just a little, you see, there's my bookshelf. We'll move my water out of the way. And so over here we have books by Stephen Graham Jones, Tommy Orange, Derek Palacio, Marie Helene Bertino, Marcelo Hernandez Castillo. That is a really, really good one. So those are some of the books I've read recently. Yeah, Crazy Horse's Girlfriend by Erica Ward. That's a good one. I like to keep the books that I turn to time and again close. Also, I read a lot of poetry. So below the books I just showed you, there's a whole shelf of poetry. I love, in particular, Dana Smith, Jamal May, who else? Erica Meitner. She has a book called Holy Moly, Carry Me that is also about guns and gun violence. And it's a beautiful book and harrowing, too, in all the right ways. So those are some examples.
I love that you're able to just turn and see your shelves. And like we should make this series into a bookshelf tour now or something.
Right?
It's
Yeah.
fun to see.
Absolutely. And this shelf is double-sided, so there's more on the other side. But yeah.
Amazing. So for those of you who are just tuning in, this is Random House Live with Toni Jensen, who is the author of Carrie. And as you said, this is a memoir in essays. I'm wondering if there was any one particular essay that you loved the most or that gave you the most satisfaction to write.
I could easily talk about the one that gave me the most trouble. The most I think that the final essay probably gave me the most satisfaction because it took a while these were all stories I wanted to tell, some from later in life and then the one kind of formative from earlier in life, about the young man I dated in high school, and then something that happened to a woman we both went to college with. And so that thread, along with the narrative thread of something that happened to me in my past that we're kind of building to throughout the whole memoir, that was finding the way to make all those pieces work together. That was really satisfying. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, especially towards the end of the book, for me, this was a very emotional read. I felt very connected to your stories, even though we don't have a ton in common in our backgrounds. And they get pretty heavy at times too. So I'm wondering if there were ways, but in the best way, readers, in the best possible way. I'm wondering if there were things that you did to kind of pull yourself back out of writing, or if there are any like fun hobbies that you kind of used to balance some of those heavier moments with your stories.
Yeah. Everyone's always asking if I have hobbies. I don't. I work all the time. You know, it's terrible. I'm working on it. I bought a bike recently. It's sitting here. We can do the bike tour too. It's sitting over there. If we can do this. All right. Yes. Bicycle, bicycle, bicycle. All right. If you've tuned in, that's my new bicycle. So I bought a bike and I'm going to ride it, and that will be very exciting. I haven't ridden a bike since undergraduate, probably. I mean, I have been on a bike, but I haven't owned and ridden regularly. Right. So I'm working on it. Fall is very nice here. It's not so hot. And I do cook. Yeah, I don't have any hobbies, Taylor. I could lie to you.
Sorry, I should have prepped you for that question before.
I just work. I'm always telling my students to do better than that, you know, and my fellow writer friends. But no, really, I work a lot and I enjoy my work. So I'm lucky in that, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So then actually, as a teacher, do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Get a hobby, get one early. Yeah, no, I mean, travel probably also was my hobby, if I'm being really honest, and we don't do that anymore, really. So, but what students I feel like should know is that when you write a thing, you're going to have to think about it for quite some time, and you're going to have to revise it probably over and over and over again, honestly. And so I would say, mainly just to be comfortable with that and to not be so hard on yourself. My students anyway, here in Arkansas and at Institute of Indian Arts and everywhere I've ever taught, they're hard on themselves. They think they should be able to produce publishable work somehow, like, you know, just right away. And that isn't necessarily how it works. It's a process. And you do need to know that it's okay, that's part of it. It's not even just okay, it's expected. I'm very suspicious of people who can just sit down always straight away and produce, you know, perfect work. I think, well, really, I mean, how does that work? That's not how it is for most of us. So just that it's a process and it takes time, and to be maybe a little more gentle with yourselves on that.
Yeah, that's really wonderful advice. I also saw on Twitter that we might be talking about candy.
Oh, I had an interview recently, and they were asking questions about what I did to sort of balance the hard content. Yeah, and so I said, you know, in one chapter, I think it's the domestic birds essay, there's my sister and I, you know, there's someone about the bad thing that happens to my nephew. And so my sister and I, fortunately, in that conversation also talked about candy. So I didn't have to look very far. But I do love candy. I bought a whole this weekend in Eureka Springs, actually, but so there's taffy in the kitchen. We won't go to the kitchen. It's not for Instagram. Not tidy, but yeah, I do really love candy, and I did eat an awful lot of candy while I wrote this book, because it's a very easy thing to do, and I would maybe not recommend that to everyone, but it did work for me in the writing process. So little pieces, not big candy, not a whole bag necessarily. Yeah, but no, just finding something sweet. Or love songs was the other thing. An essay that didn't end up making it in the book has love songs interwoven throughout it, because I dated a couple of musicians and because my father was a musician. And so the idea of music as balance, something beautiful and or tasty, is necessary, I think, if you're going to write about gun violence and, you know, the bad things that happen.
Amazing. Well, I think we've covered all the main topics then, now that we finally crossed candy off the list. And we're just out of time here. But thank you so much, Toni, for joining us. And I cannot recommend Toni's book enough, Carrie. It's absolutely beautiful. And I hope that you'll all check it out.
Thanks, Taylor.
Thanks, Toni. Bye.
Bye.